Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond, my channel where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today we're taking a brief detour from my look at the James Bond films we were in the middle of discussing on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and that part 2 will be coming shortly. But I wanted to get this video out there to discuss the horror elements of the Bond stories just in time for Halloween. It's peak spooky season, so the timing couldn't be better. And this is a video that I've wanted to record for a very long time. I'm a big horror film and horror story buff. That's another one of my passions as a cinephile. And the Bond stories have always had a curious relationship to horror tropes. In fact, if you know my core thesis about what the Bond series is about, and the Bond series is about many things, it's about the nature of Britain, it's about the nature of masculinity in some ways, but it is, at its core, a fantasy about death and hedonism, counteracting the anxiety of death, that sort of existential threat that we all face with pleasure. And James Bond kind of embodies that dichotomy in a very extreme way and is allowing the audience to kind of live vicariously through him in a very safe way, in the same way that horror films allow us to encounter the anxieties of death and then still walk out of the movie theater afterwards safe and sound. There is a sort of parallelism between a Bond film and a horror movie, in my mind at the very least, in the sense of them both being roller coasters that are bringing us into an encounter with this sort of anxiety of death. Bond tends to do it a lot more lightly and adventurously than your standard horror movie, but those impulses are there. And in this, it's no surprise then that in Bond, which is a quintessentially pulp storytelling vessel, you get a lot of those energies channeled into the movies. In fact, when the most recent Bond movie came out, No Time to Die, it was a common talking point among reviewers and Bond fans that the opening of No Time to Die is a lot like a horror movie. And I thought that couldn't have been more appropriate. It was actually striking to see a Bond movie so boldly embrace that sort of horror texture for a moment. In No Time to Die's opening, which stages a flashback to Madeleine's childhood, where Safin, the sort of gothic horror villain archetype, Safin is really modeled off of the Phantom of the Opera, this disfigured, obsessive villain who wears a mask and is obsessed by the beauty of this young girl. That character comes to stalk her in her home as a child and kills her mother, and this confrontation unfolds. It's a nightmare sequence that opens up No Time to Die. And as much as that feels like a slight deviation from the genre of your typical Bond adventure, that felt appropriate to me because Bond has always kind of bled over into horror textures, even going back to Ian Fleming. Not all of Ian Fleming's stories have the same level of sort of gothic horror texture, but sometimes Fleming went quite extreme with it. In my favorite Ian Fleming novel, You Only Live Twice, which is essentially a surreal, dreamlike chronicle of Bond reeling from the death of his wife, Tracy, Bond is put through a sort of nightmarish gauntlet where he confronts death quite literally. In that novel, Blofeld is a quite different character than he's been rendered in movies. Blofeld has gone quite a bit insane, and his main ambition is just essentially to lure people to suicide in his garden of death, which is a nightmarish space where pretty much everything in the garden can kill you. If you've seen No Time to Die, you've seen a very a similar idea with Safin's poison garden, but in the novel, it's a much more expansive all-encompassing concept. Bond really has to survive that garden, and he witnesses some pretty horrific events in this giant garden where it's not just the plants that can kill you, but like it's just a death trap unto itself. And Fleming really goes all in on the sort of gothic textures that sometimes lurk in his work. Pulp storytelling, as a tradition, generally veers in and out of horror territory. A good example here would be, Batman, a quintessential pulp hero, modeled off of another pulp hero, The Shadow. And, his core villain, the Joker, is very much a horror villain, modeled after Conrad Veidt's The Man Who Laughs, and is essentially, in his initial introduction in the comics, like a true serial killer. It's a really kind of spooky comic if you've read the first introduction of the Joker into the Batman canon. That sort of spooky element has always been part of pulp adventure, and Fleming dabbles with that not just in the kind of like Baroque excesses of something like the Garden of Death, but he also veers occasionally into what we might call like creature feature horror territory. Bond tangles with a giant squid as part of Dr. No's sort of like torture obstacle course in Ian Fleming's Dr. No. It's a sequence that's never been adapted to film, but could be interpreted in interesting ways if you were to take that sort of obstacle course concept. That's one of those set pieces that, like the Garden of Death, I've always kind of wanted to see in a film and hasn't really been done. Even though the Poison Garden shows up in No Time to Die, we've never really had Bond have to survive that sort of like death gauntlet, the way that Fleming kind of returns to that trope. His villains are also in of themselves kind of like sinister and horrific figures, very predatory, very, very chilling archetypes. Fleming's villains were by nature made to be pretty grotesque characters, and he even gives us, to make the point even more direct, like Fleming even has a character named Horror. What more do you need? So when the films start to pull from this, you start to see a lot of those elements carry over. Certainly the Connery era has things like Dr. No's dragon tank burning people alive, adding this sort of like weird hint of superstition to what is otherwise Bond investigating the death of an agent in Jamaica. There's this sort of hint of the uncanny that kind of trickles in the way that Dr. No has cloaked himself in the air of the supernatural. You see it in the way villains in the Connery eras are continually like dispensing henchmen with, brutal execution by exotic means, death in a pool of sharks or death by piranha. I actually think the way the film series works and has proceeded over the years is honestly the elements where horror comes out the most strongly in these movies is honestly in some of the more lighthearted adventures. The good example in the Connery era is the way Goldfinger, a fairly lighthearted entertainment, foregrounds this fairly chilling image of a woman killed by gold paint. She's encased in gold paint, and that's how she dies. It's outlandish, but it's a pretty haunting idea. Before I became preoccupied with the Bond series as an adolescent, I have this sort of distant memory of being at my uncle's house and catching some of Goldfinger on TV and just being utterly terrified of the image of this girl encased in gold, and that's how she died. That, like right down to the end credits, showing her visage as the credits play. I just remember being just haunted by the very idea of it. And it's very horrific. It could have shown up in an Italian horror movie of the same period. 1960s and 1970s was a period in Italian horror cinema where it was going for incredibly Baroque excesses. That's the kind of methodology of murder that would easily have shown up in one of those films of that era, predominantly known as giallo. If you're familiar with the filmmakers Mario Bava or Dario Argento, they're the, you know, star directors of that mode. And it's interesting that that kind of exists in a lighter adventure. And similarly, the I think inarguably spookiest Bond movie, Live and Let Die, is again a fairly jaunty adventure. Live and Let Die really captures a few different pieces of British horror cinema of that time. If you know about the British filmmaking period in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, horror was very central for the British filmmaking world. And it was a small world. You know, Britain is not the largest country, and there was a lot of, you know, sharing among production teams and casts between what was a thriving horror film industry with Hammer horror right at its center. If you know anything about those wonderful films like Horror of Dracula, Curse of Frankenstein, the films that gave Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee their reputation, and all the other films that were being made at that period. So it's no surprise that, for example, Britt Ekland was cast in The Man with the Golden Gun because of her appearance in the horror film The Wicker Man, the iconic British horror film of that time. So you kind of get this crossover. And in Live and Let Die, you really start to get some of the uncanny feeling that was showing up in other horror movies of that time. For example, the horror film The Plague of the Zombies. It's relatively obscure, but it captures some of this weird tension between the sort of imperialist Britain and the fringes of empire, the sort of places where the colonized peoples of the world have these sort of darker beliefs that defy the belief systems of westernized Christian Britain. And you get that tension creeping up into Live and Let Die, and Live and Let Die foregrounds has both its opening and climactic set piece human sacrifice. It's really kind of wild to have that in a Bond movie done that way. It's not something the series has ever attempted again, but I'm here for it. I love that the movie is flirting with those textures. I love that the movie flirts with the idea that the supernatural may actually be there. It's a little coy with it. It doesn't quite jump over into Bond versus the supernatural, but there's definitely the suggestion that Solitaire's clairvoyance might actually have something to it. And then at the end, the final suggestion that Baron Samedi has survived his confrontation with Bond, that there actually might be something to this voodoo thing altogether. It's played as a final joke, but it is kind of chilling, and Jeffrey Holder's laugh is fairly haunting as a final note. It's no surprise that for this video's thumbnail, I have chosen an image from the Live and Let Die title sequence, which is in and of itself kind of spooky and uncanny and dark. And you kind of get that sort of element, that balance between the kind of levity of the Moore era and these horror elements creeping up later. The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker both dabble with some fairly dark sequences, especially with Jaws stalking the man at the pyramids and at the club in The Spy Who Loved Me. Jaws being introduced as a fairly threatening character before he becomes a punchline. And then in Moonraker, the death of Corinne by, she's torn apart by dogs off screen is a sequence that could have come straight out of a Dario Argento movie of that period. And then you have Jaws stalking a woman in an alleyway in Rio in one of the creepiest moments in the Bond series. Despite the fact that Jaws is treated as a joke elsewhere in that movie, that sequence is really kind of skin-crawling and creepy. And there's kind of this wonderful balance between light and dark in those movies in the ways that, because those moments come almost like out of left field in those movies a little bit, like these jokey movies, these jokey, surreal adventures that suddenly take right turns into nightmare territory before pivoting back into like the jolly levity of Roger Moore adventures again. they almost kind of like carry a little bit more bite. That's one thing I generally enjoy in movies is like big tonal swings, because they tend to make comedy feels more comic when it's juxtaposed against things that are not particularly comedic, and horror can feel more horrific when it is isolated from a general atmosphere of dread, when it just kind of takes you by surprise. And these films of the 70s and 80s in which Roger Moore participated have a lot of those weird moments when they kind of lean into those spooky tones. Though I think if there is another spooky Bond movie besides Live and Let Die, it's 2015 Spectre. Now, Spectre is a film that I don't really think works, and if you want to know more about my analysis of that movie, you can watch my long-winded video on Spectre. But Spectre is really about trying to build a James Bond ghost story. It is about Bond, who is a dead man walking in that movie. He is the embodiment of death. He is introduced as a human skeleton. He is wearing sunglasses throughout the movie that kind of emphasize that same skull socket effect. He is a man who is dead, and the question in that movie is, like, will he choose to become a living person by leaving the Secret Service? He's haunted by ghosts. He's haunted by the ghost of his past in Hans Oberhauser. He's haunted by the digital ghost of M, who died in the previous adventure. So there's this sort of general aura of ghostliness about Spectre, and in the way it's filmed and presented. And nowhere does that come more to the forefront than in the Rome sequence of that movie, where Bond attends a funeral and then ends up in this sort of strange, dreamlike version of a Spectre meeting. Spectre meetings in the 1960s were more corporate. But in the film Spectre, it's like an Eyes Wide Shut style gothic, nightmarish vision where Blofeld holds a sort of uncanny hold over everyone in the room, just speaking, and his words just followed by silence. And everyone in the room just stands by and witnesses this act of horrific violence as Hinks executes a man in front of all of them. It's actually a pretty terrific sequence, and is the one sequence where I feel that movie figures out what it's trying to do very well, and really becomes what I would call a true James Bond ghost story. I kind of wish the rest of the movie had leaned as strongly into that sort of spooky, uncanny feeling, because it would have really given the film a fully unique texture in the series that would have also helped give a lot of the other story elements a little bit of existential weight. I think part of the problem with that movie is you get wonderful visceral sequences like that, but then so much of the movie is just people standing around spouting nonsense exposition in rooms at one another, explaining the story rather than just kind of carrying us through it. And I think the one thing that worked very well about something like, the Roger Moore epics is that they were free to follow a little bit more dream logic. They just kind of leapt from sequence to sequence. And Spectre doesn't really quite follow that same principle, even though it effectively does feel stitched together from sequences. There's just so much characters talking at each other that it feels very literal, when that movie could just feel very ethereal and dreamlike and visceral in a way that follows a little bit more dream logic. And that sequence really gets at the heart of that, and I think nicely prefigures No Time to Die's kind of leap into horror film texture to accompany the film that will be the death of James Bond. So I've been talking here for 20 minutes about this topic, so I'm probably going to bring it to a close here. But let me know how you all feel about these horror textures in James Bond. There are moments I obviously haven't talked about in the course of this this video, just for sake of time. I mean, you could create a whole video about Bond's encounters with dangerous animals and beasts, from Komodo dragons to snakes to spiders and things like that. And that in and of itself is just a kind of thread of the way horror can sometimes run through these movies. So let me know what your favorite horror moments are in the series. What moments potentially, freaked you out as a kid. Let me know. I'd love to hear from you all. And also let me know how you'd like to see the Bond series build on this thread in the future. Personally, this is something I think the series could very easily explore again. It would be great to have Bond facing off a villain with a cult again. I mean, that's a trope we've seen a few times, but the last time it showed up was in License to Kill, and it was really more of a side element. I think that could be fun. That certainly showed up in the continuation novels a little bit. I'd also love to see, something a little bit more exaggerated, like Bond doing, Dr. No's survival gauntlet obstacle course. And you could do a lot of fun things, like Bond potentially, solving his way out of some weird jigsaw, saw puzzles or something like that. Those are all fun ideas to me. Let me know if you find that idea equally as fun, or whether you kind of want the series to stay away from that going forward. But for me, who loves the outlandish side of Bond, this has always been a sweet spot for the Bond series, and I've always enjoyed where the series leans into it. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.